The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I'm in this strange position of introducing myself today, because usually I'm introducing other speakers. So, Paul Magee studied language and literature in Melbourne, Moscow, San Salvador and Sydney. He's Professor of Poetry at the University of Canberra, where he directs the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. And his most recent book is Suddenness and the Composition of Poetic Thought, from Rowman and Littlefield. Now, with this paper, I am going to read the first 15 minutes or so, and that's because the argument is relatively complex, and that'll stop me from going off the rails, but I'll start freestyling after that, once I've established a little bit of a platform. I saw a fragile of on the everyday English syntax of Finnegans Wake. This paper explores the idea that even though the language of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake is extremely idiosyncratic, that characterisation only applies to the work's vocabulary, for the grammar is normative. The observation is common among commentators, though it often comes with a note of surprise, because this is, after all, a book set in Ireland. In a 1964 issue of the Centennial Review, F.G. Anseko wrote that, quote, "The amazing thing about the book is not how wild its syntax is, but on the contrary, how conservative it is, considering the oniric experience Joyce wants to convey. There is no grammatical nihilism in Joyce. His is principally a method of obtaining results, of obtaining effects by superposition of meanings, a device in which his craftsmanship shines without challenge." And Anseko's comments echo, but seem not to have been influenced by, Clive Hart's earlier and well-known treatment of the matter. Quoting Hart, "Beneath the massive superstructure of interwoven motifs, there is a fundamental syntactical clarity and simplicity. So much so that compared with the radical literary experiments of the 1920s and 1930s, Finnegans Wake is almost conventional in style. Joyce makes no attempt to dispense with clause structure, as do Stein, Jolis, or the Dadaists." Now, there's nuances in both Anseko and Hart's positions to be returned to below. Meanwhile, more recent articulations of the underlying conservatism of the Wake's grammar include Jean-Michel Rabate's description of the work's language as, quote, "a new lingua franca based on English grammar and the grafting of a few other lexicons onto this syntactical and narratological grid." And Elizabeth Bonnefell's observation that, quote, "despite the inclusion of often confusing portmanteau words and despite its digressions, the Wake nonetheless has a basic English syntax structure. The syntax of Finnegans Wake is 95% English." I love that idea, 95%. Now, those based upon and 5% nuances are again significant. But for the moment, we can note an overall strong consensus on the normative nature of the Wake's grammar and specifically of its syntax, which is to say its way of ordering words into sentences. Textual scholar David Greetham has even sought to elevate that normativity to an editorial principle. If the opening and closing sentences of Finnegans Wake read shore of swerve or swerve shore of instead of swerve of shore, then the regulatory function of word order could be called upon to question the reading. That's to say, if you had a copy of an edition of the Wake where that phrase in this first sentence from the book was mangled in that fashion, you'd suspect an error somehow in the transmission of the text, say from the manuscript to the printer or something like that. He's suggesting we can take this syntactic normativity actually as firm enough a principle to even edit the text and any mistakes in its transmission that way. Leaving aside the controversy surrounding Danis Rose and John O'Hanlon's second edition of Finnegans Wake, the work Greetham is in this fashion introducing, allow us simply to note the place of Greetham's claims in the tradition of highlighting the Wake's syntactical conservatism sketched above, and the strange contrast that tradition forms with other characterisations of the Wake's relation to language. So Jacques Lacan will, for instance, approvingly paraphrase Philippe Solaire's aphorism that Joyce wrote it in such a way that the English language no longer exists. That's the consequence of this book. How could Solaire, and through him Lacan, make that claim if the Wake's diction really does just comprise strange vocabulary expressed through normative syntax? Nor are Lacan and Solaire alone in seeing Joyce's final work as a full-scale attack upon the common tongue that I'm trying to speak at the moment, talking about it. The following paper will show that the Wake's syntax is more complex than traditional appeals to its, quote, underlying conservatism suggest, and will be brought a little closer to Lacan and Solaire's positions in the process. Exploring the Wake in this regard will at the same time cast light upon a number of key issues to do with Joyce's final work, including the distinct types of meaning it conveys and the relative ease with which readers can sight read and perform so many of its phrases. Noam Chomsky makes a pertinent remark upon the performability of grammatical sentences, regardless of how nonsensical those sentences might appear. His remarks will underline the value of attending to the Wake's syntactical clarity. In an often cited passage from his 1957 text, Syntactical Structures, Chomsky notes that sentences 1 and 2 are equally nonsensical, but any speaker of English will recognise that only the former is grammatical. 1, colourless green ideas sleep furiously. 2, furiously sleep ideas green colourless. Now, the passage that immediately follows in this text of Chomsky's has not received as much attention, but it contains a fascinating observation on the contrasting ways our bodies interface with these two utterances as we read them. Quoting Chomsky, presented with these sentences, a speaker of English will read 1 with a normal sentence intonation, but he will read 2 with a falling intonation on each word. In fact, with just the intonation pattern given to any sequence of unrelated words. He treats each word in 2 as a separate phrase. Similarly, he will be able to recall 1 much more easily than 2, to learn it much more quickly, etc. Chomsky proceeds, in a second example, to tackle a pair of phrases reminiscent of Greetham's contrast between swerve of shore and swerve shore of. Now, to recall, Greetham suggested that if the published text of the first sentence of Finnegans Wake went river run from swerve shore of to bend of bay, rather than river run from swerve of shore to bend of bay, we'd be entitled to suspect a printer's error. As for Chomsky, the 2 sentences he proceeds to table are, I saw a fragile whale and I saw a fragile of. Chomsky remarks that, as was the case with colourless green ideas sleep furiously sleep ideas green colourless, A competent speaker will, quote, immediately recognise that the first string gives a grammatical sentence, but not the second. Extending Chomsky's earlier remarks about intonation, we might observe that as well as being immediately recognised as grammatical, the nonsensical sentence, I saw a fragile whale, will be read with a normal sentence intonation. Whereas I saw a fragile of will appear ungrammatical, and by the same token will be read with what we've seen Chomsky describe as, quote, a falling intonation on each word. In fact, with just the intonation pattern given to any sequence of unrelated words. So it'll be read in the same staccato fashion as furiously sleep, ideas, green, colourless. So such are the examples through which Chomsky prosecutes his epoch-making claim that, quote, grammar is autonomous and independent of meaning. His claim, as we've seen, is that all four of these phrases are nonsensical, but two of them are in addition recognisably grammatical. And one indice of this is their performability. So let's put some pieces together here. We have a tradition of commentators proposing that, quote, sentence structure rather than vocabulary is normative in the wake. Noam Chomsky, meanwhile, shows us that a grammatical sentence will feel correct and be performable regardless of how nonsensical. Now, the confluence of these two positions gives us an interesting angle on many of Joyce's comments as to what he was doing in the wake. For it seemed to suggest that the normativity of the book's syntax was part and parcel of Joyce's desire to generate a readily performable vocal score. An anecdote cited in Gabrielle Carey's recent James Joyce Alive is apropos. Quote, when asked whether his work in progress was a blending of literature and music, Joyce replied, no, it's pure music. But are there not levels of meaning to be explored? The questioner pressed. No, said Joyce, it's meant to make you laugh. One could cite at this point revealing comments by various translators who worked with Joyce on Finnegans Wake. Philippe Soupeau and Paul Lyon on the French version, Nino Frank on the Italian. One could cite their comments as to Joyce's overriding concern with ensuring the work's soundscape over and above matters of meaning, which apparently is quite happy to just not really worry if it made sense or if meanings were communicated, as long as it's sung well. One might nonetheless pause on that curious comment about laughter. It's meant to make you laugh. Can you really generate laughter without invoking elements of meaning? Roman Jakobson turns Chomsky's argument on its head. Far from demonstrating that grammar is autonomous and independent of meaning, for Jakobson, that famous doublet, colourless green ideas sleep furiously and furiously sleep ideas green colourless, that doublet for Jakobson serves to prove that the more grammatical a sentence is, the more meaning it conveys. At the same time, Jakobson will retain Chomsky's intriguing suggestion that grammaticality goes hand in hand with performability. Jakobson's 1959 article, Boas's View of Grammatical Meaning, is focused on the work of the famous anthropologist and linguist of North American languages, Franz Boas, who died in 1942. Jakobson hones in on Boas's idea that grammar, quote, determines those aspects of experience that must be expressed in any given language. And to explain what he's getting at, in English, we cannot use a noun without simultaneously conveying whether it is singular or plural. So if the noun is car, you have to say car or cars. You know, that information just has to be expressed. And when it comes to any fuller context, say when we get to the level of a phrase or a clause, we also have to make clear whether we have a definite car or set of cars or even the general category of all cars in mind. So the sentence will be something like, I don't like the car, I don't like the cars, I don't like a car, I don't like some cars, I don't like cars. Okay? You have to express information about number and definiteness, these are aspects of experience that must be expressed whenever we use an English noun in a clause. Yeah? Even if that noun totally escapes the reader's understanding as to what it is, it's still got to be expressed to convey those aspects of experience: singularity, plurality, definiteness, indefiniteness, generality. Now, you don't have to indicate these things when using a noun in Chinese. You can, of course, convey them lexically, just as we speaking English can convey lexically. It's just through paraphrase, through using other words. We can convey all of these kind of distinctions, right? In English, those ones are all obligatory if it's a noun that you're going to use. Not so in Chinese, but there's other obligations to express aspects of experience in Chinese. So Jakobson's point, contra Chomsky, is that because it determines those aspects of experience that must be expressed, any given grammatical form will necessarily convey meaning. I'll flesh this out by giving you a passage from the Wake and showing you exactly how this argument would work. So this is a passage from the Scholarly Disquisition that takes up most of Book 1, Chapter 5. I just need to wet my whistle before attempting a bit of Joyce. Let us now, whether health, dangers, public orders, and other circumstances permitting, of perfectly convenient, if you police, after you, police, pardoning mine, ich beam so fresh, bay, drop this jiggery pokery and talk straight turkey, meat to mate. For while the ear, be we Michaels or Nicholists, may sometimes be inclined to believe others, the eye, whether browned or no-lensed, find it devilish hard now and again even to believe itself. Habes ores id num videbis? Habes oculos ac mane palpabuat? Tip. Drawing nearer to take our slant at it, since after all it is met with misfortune while all underground, let us see all there may remain to be seen. I am a worker, a tombstone mason, anxious to police everybody's and jolly glad when Christmas comes his once a year. You are a poor joist, unctuous to police note bobbies and tunny bully solly when 'tis time to go home, gin. We cannot say eye to eye. We cannot smile nose from nose. Still, one cannot help noticing that rather more than half of the lines run north-south in the Nemzis and Bucharest directions, while the others go west-east in search from Malazais with Bulgarad, for, tiny tot though it looks when nistling alongside other incunabula, it has its cardinal points for all that. Let's focus in on two little sentences. I'm a worker, a tombstone mason, anxious to please everybody's, and jolly glad when Christmas comes his once a year. You are a poor joist, unctuous to police note bobbies, and tunny bully solly when 'tis time to go home, gin. We cannot say eye to eye. We cannot smile nose from nose. Following Jakobson's Boasian lead, we can claim that even if the word everybody's defeats us as to its basic meaning, we can still be confident encountering it in this 95% English context that it is an entity and that there must be more than one of them. Right? These are aspects that have to be experienced when you use a noun in English. What is more, we can tell we're not dealing with a proper noun here, for that would have to be indicated with an initial capital. In like fashion, even if the word poor joist encountered in you are a poor joist were to confuse us as to its meaning, we would still know that we're once more dealing with an entity, and just one rather than a group of them. At the same time, that grammatical meaning of singularity flows back to the you at the start of the clause, clarifying that it too refers to a singular rather than a plural subject. Likewise, whatever its dictionary meaning, tunnabelly is clearly an intensifier, giving added force to the way in which the you in question is being solely. All of which underlines Jakobson's point, quote, any difference of grammatical categories carries semantic information. Jakobson does not, however, discuss Finnegans' wake. His way of illustrating the unsustainability of a, quote, anti-semantic theory of grammatical structure is to find meanings in the very sentence we've seen Chomsky characterise as grammatical but meaningless. Quoting Jakobson, applying this sort of analysis to Chomsky's examples, thus passing the allegedly nonsensical sentence, colourless green ideas sleep furiously, we extract its pluralised topic, ideas, said to develop a sleeping activity, and both terms are characterised, the ideas as colourless green and the sleep as furious. These grammatical relations create a meaningful sentence, unquote. So for Jakobson, Chomsky has not demonstrated that grammaticality is distinct from meaning, not in the slightest. Actually, the syntactical clarity of colourless green ideas sleep furiously ensures that it is freighted with meaning. On the other hand, again quoting Jakobson, the more the syntactic forms and the relational concepts which they carry appear to be obliterated, the less they can be said to be meaningful. This is the case for this second string of words, furiously sleep, ideas green, colourless. Jakobson proceeds to state that, quote, phrasal intonation alone holds together such mot in liberté, words in free fall. So otherwise put, when hearing this kind of agrammatical, meaningless string of words, one adopts what we've seen Chomsky describe as, quote, a falling intonation on each word. In fact, with just the intonation pattern given to any sequence of unrelated words. The reader, quote, treats each word in two as a separate phrase. Confining his prosodic comments to utterances of this order, Jakobson leaves unstated whether he accepts Chomsky's equation between grammaticality and performability, though it's surely implied by these last comments. Assuming it is, there's a corollary we can draw here, highly pertinent to our consideration of Finnegans' wake. And that corollary would hold that whenever any string of words elicits a normal sentence intonation from us, we've already started to find meanings in those words. Jakobson's intervention helps us to understand why we so frequently feel we've gained a smattering of what is going on in any given Wakian sentence, and especially in those in which the speech cues seem obvious, even as the meaning of specific lexical items like nope bobbies and tunny belly elude us. But we can take this much further. Let's consider the passage I focused on again before, and in particular, one sentence within it. We cannot say eye to eye. Now, as one's pondering this string of words, obviously there's something nonsensical about it, but meanings arise as well. And it's true, following Jakobson, that the syntax itself brings meanings to bear. The sort of meanings that accrue to subject, modal auxiliary verb, object, preposition, object, there are elements of meaning that accrue just because those grammatical categories are being tapped. You do get meaning out of that, as Jakobson argues, and the phrase is readily performable. We cannot say eye to eye. There's no question as to how to perform it. You can intuitively read it off the page. However, what I want to now claim, extending Jakobson's contributions, is that the performability and key elements of the meaning we take from this string of 6 words, they're not just a matter of the syntactical clarity of that string of words. Those meanings and the performability also arises from the way it ghosts a common idiom. We cannot see eye to eye. Yeah? That's there and that's informing whatever meanings we take from this as well. It's not just the syntactic relations. It's also that it's tapping that, if you like, that memory or that kind of template in our heads. And actually, when you think about it, the meanings that pertain to the syntax, for instance, the idea that I is the direct object of say, they're rustling against the idiom. Because in the idiom, I to I is not really the object of see. It's more like an adverbial phrase. It's a manner of seeing or something. Yeah? So that there's almost two regimes of meaning that are jostling there. And even more curiously, that generic meaning, that ghosted phrase, we cannot see eye to eye, seems to inform the next sentence as well. We cannot smile nose from nose. You still hear we cannot see eye to eye in the background. So that generic meaning seems to attach to both these phrases. And underlying them all, I'm suggesting what we're hearing is this: we cannot see eye to eye. Now, what we're dealing with here, with we cannot see eye to eye, is what linguists call a construction. And what I'm going to invoke now is an extraordinary shift in linguistic thinking that's occurred over the last 30 years. And I'll suggest that it can illuminate what is going on in Wakian phrases like the two that I've just tabled. And also that it can help us make sense of the Wake's relation to meaning and prosody more generally, taking us even further along the path that Jakobson has charted for us. This new approach, called construction or usage-based grammar, amounts to an attempt to take idiomatic expressions like we cannot see eye to eye as the very model of what a language is. It's an attempt to model languages more generally on the basis of the idioms within them, rather than highly abstract patterns of so-called rules like subject, verb, object. So let's leave Joyce for a moment and just focus on this new approach to grammar. Like I said, idiomaticity is at the fore of it. So if we take an expression like this, we can see it's got fixed elements to it, like see eye to eye. You can't really muck with those if you're using this idiom, unless you're James Joyce, but we're leaving him out of the room for the moment. So you can't say, for instance, we cannot see eyes to eyes. It's actually quite rigidly fixed, that element of the idiom. Nonetheless, the expression also has some open slots where there's a certain freedom of movement in terms of what you can place there. So you can say we, you, they cannot see eye to eye. You can do it in the past. You can use a verb like able to. They were able to see eye to eye. They were not able to, and so forth. So as well as having fixed elements, it's got open slots where there's a degree of substitutability, but that has limits as well. So if I write, I cannot see eye to eye, it just doesn't really work. Bruce cannot see eye to eye. You might start thinking he's got an optometrical problem or something. Yeah, the phrase is, that's clearly outside of the paradigm of possibilities within the open slot. In other words, there's a kind of mini grammar here. Yeah. Now, someone might respond and say, look, that's not a paradigm. It's just about using words that make sense. You know, obviously you can't say I cannot see eye to eye because it just doesn't make sense. That's because it violates the meaning of mutuality that is packed into this idiomatic expression. And the construction grammarians come back and say, yeah, well, meaning is actually part of grammar. This is a mini grammar. It does have meaning. And what it excludes by dint of meaning is part of the syntax of it, if you like. This is our Jakobsonian point. Any difference of grammatical categories carries semantic information. It's just that these particular bunch of grammarians are starting to say that is a grammatical category in its own right, to be placed next to, the future tense or next to the way we form adverbs. Just happens to be a highly idiomatic one. So what we have here in this idiom is a grammatical form with fixed elements and open slots, and it serves to convey a generic meaning to do with mutual understanding. What's more, it has a very clear historicity. The OED tells us that this idiom is first attested in 1747. Now, it appeared at that time as an allusion to a phrase in the King James translation of Isaiah 52:8, for they shall see eye to eye when the Lord shall bring again Zion. In the original context, this phrase, see eye to eye, in that King James translation context, it's just a literal translation of a Hebrew phrase, ayin b'ayin, which actually meant something much more like see with their own eyes. And that seems to be what was intended in the King James translation as well. And they just translated literally across from the Hebrew. So actually, the 1747 allusion that gives birth to our current idiom is in the nature of a misunderstanding, of a not very good translation of what's basically Hebrew. Right? Now, the other thing that's interesting to learn from the OED is that for the first 100 or so years of its currency, this idiom was largely used positively and in the future tense, to do with that future heavenly moment when people will understand each other. Around about the middle of the 19th century, it starts to flip its valency and starts to get used negatively to deal with not being able to see eye to eye, which is largely the usage nowadays, not being able to see eye to eye in the past or present. Very useful phrase for obvious reasons. Now let's compare this idiom that we've unpacked with something that will seem the very essence of grammatical form. And I think as I do this, you'll start to see the relevance of this sort of thing for understanding the wake. So let's take the ed ending that serves to generate a simple past from the vast majority of verbs in English. It also has a paradigmatic quality in that there's a totally fixed element to it, that ed, but there's also an open slot where lots of different forms can be substituted. You can have walk there, type, hope, and it becomes walked, typed, hoped, and so forth. Almost all the verbs in the language can fit in that space. But actually, it's not universal. There's about 200 verbs in English that you can't put ed on the end of, as we know when we listen to kids who make that mistake. Now, actually, this ed past tense has a real history to it as well. As Joan Bybee shows, that ed ending did not arise by fiat. It's an outcome of a historical process. Those 200 or so verbs in English that form a past tense along the model of drink, drank, tell, told, sing, sung, and so forth, they harken back to a much older way of forming a past in Germanic languages through internal vowel change. And it seems what happened is that in the 8th to the 11th century, you had all these second language speaking Vikings who arrive in the British Isles, and they're trying to get their tongues around English, and they're getting totally lost trying to get the internal vowel changes right. Like help in the past, I helped, used to be I help. Help, help. Yeah, that would confuse me as a Viking, and it seems to have happened to those Nordic folk as well. So what they did to solve this problem is they started plonking the Old English equivalent of did on the end of verbs. It was something like dido or dede, right? So you started to get pigeon formations of the order of help did, walk did, reach did. Yeah. Now that gets used more and more because it's so useful. You don't have to say I help them. Yeah, you can just be I help did them. Eventually, through extra usage, the second word in that compound reduces, and it starts to become an inflection, and it starts to occur on the end of the verb, and it becomes helped, walked, and so forth. In other words, there is just as much historicity in that past tense ed as there is in this idiom. Yeah. And ultimately, it functions the same way as something that has fixed elements and open slots with albeit restricted membership. It turns out that you can analyse all grammatical forms in this way as a crystallisation of earlier idioms. As the linguist Telmi Givon once put it, today's morphology is yesterday's syntax. So, for instance, you can make the same demonstration of the ly that we use to create adverbs. That used to be a word lick, which meant body. So king lick would be king body, king shape, something like that. Yeah. Squarely comes from square lick, square body, and so forth. And it just gets used so much that that idiom crystallizes into grammar, into a grammatical morpheme. But again, you can't form all adverbs that way. There's restrictions there as well, just like there is in any idiom. So what we're doing there, what this approach to grammatical theory is doing, is collapsing the distinction between idiom and grammatical inflection, suggesting that in either case, what you have is a historically given form-meaning pairing, combining a fixed element and open slots to convey a general meaning. But that's not all. This kind of analysis can extend to any linguistic pattern where there's fixed and open slots that convey a general meaning. So prefixes, suffixes, comparatives, future auxiliaries, possessive and conditional clauses, all of these can be called constructions. And you can analyse all of them in the same way that you might analyse some of my favourite idioms. Oh, well, this is just a very common one, the way idiom. Rasselas dug his way out of the Happy Valley. The wounded soldiers limped their way across the field. She snorted her way through 10 lines of cocaine, and so forth. It has something to do with movement, creating a passage through some sort of difficulty. You cannot shift that word way. Most of the rest of it is relatively open. There'll be semantic restrictions, but that way functions like the ED in the past tense. Yeah, it's a grammatical morpheme, effectively, and some linguists have described it that way. I love this one. This is an article called I Don't Want to Go All Yoko Ono on You. And you can go all Yoko Ono on someone. You can go Freddy Krueger on someone. You can go, Chris Christie can go full Chris Christie on Marco Rubio. Yeah, again, we're talking about an idiom that actually operates like a mini grammar. A personal favourite of mine is the don't know from a bar of soap. I think that's such a wonderful idiom. But at any rate, through this way of looking at things, you say, yeah, we can put all these on a level. As Adele Goldberg notes, the concept of construction can apply to all levels of grammatical analysis. In other words, it's constructions all the way down. And that itself is a construction. Yeah, it's open slot all the way down. You're probably hearing it's turtles all the way down at the basis of it. But again, through this way of looking at things, we can say, yeah, that's part of the grammar of the language. And that ED, past tense, is part of the idiom of the language, the idioms. Okay, I'll draw this to a conclusion by noting that in the commentator tradition on Finnegans Wake, in as much as people allow that 5% where they say this is not normative English syntax, what they point to is the sentences in the Wake. And they point to the fact that Joyce's sentences are so long and unwieldy that you lose all sense of where you are. And also they point to the fact that they're rhythmically slack, that you lose your sense as you're reading them of the kind of overarching intonational contour that would give you that sense of grasping one's single meaning or, you know, a proposition from that sentence. And again, taking that Jacobsonian point that I was trying to make earlier, I think you could say that, yeah, the sentence is just not functioning as the backbone of meaning. What we find instead with most any Joycean passage is that meaning is all devolving upon the kind of things I've just looked at and called constructions, or said are exemplary of what a construction is. They also model all other aspects of pattern within the language. But it seems to be the thing that Joyce is bringing up again and again is something like, if you like, idiom. If the proverbial bishop of our holy and undivided with this me ken or no me ken zot is the Christian, Havermashed had his 2 nails on the head, we are in for a sequentiality of improbable possibles, though possibly nobody, after having grubbed up a lock of quold corn above his subject, probably in Aristotle's or the Bible, will go out of his way to applaud him on the onboyest back of his remark, for utterly impossible as are all these events, they are probably as like those which may have taken place as any others which never took person at all are ever likely to be. I don't think we're really taking this in as a single sentence, making one clear proposition about the nature of reality. To the contrary, I think what is pushing through this just again and again as the fundamental points of syntactical clarity and simplicity are things like the proverbial bishop of, wholly and undivided, zot is the question, 2 nails on the head, we are in for, though possibly nobody will go out of his way, which may have taken place, which never took person at all, are ever likely. What Joyce is doing is bringing the constructions to the fore again and again and again, and making you feel that whatever rules of meaning and prosody holding this together, they're highly idiomatic ones. Yeah? Deeply entrenched in the history of the language, and that's really what's coming across in this picture of whatever the hell is going on. If I said anything more at this point, I would be totally confused. So I'm just going to stop at this moment and throw it open to any questions or comments.
Paul, it feels like you're trying to give value to some things that we might think of as cliches in talking about them as constructions, and things like go all Yoko Ono on you. And though it reminds me of the idea that a cliche begins as a fresh piece of language. Like the first person who said, don't go all Yoko on me, that was an interesting, fresh thing. And then they travel through to being just an ordinary bit of the language. And then it's like Joyce has said, I'm going to recreate that to make it fresh again. I just wonder what your comment on that is.
I love that observation. Thank you. That's wonderful. Yes, I think that is part of what Joyce is doing, is renovating our sense of unusualness and the historical particularity of so many aspects of the way we talk, because we lace our conversation with these things. I mean, according to construction grammar, these are our key pivotal points of meaning. And yeah, we can call them cliches. I mean, what they are is statistical regularities. And maybe to think of them in terms of cliches is really useful too, because it underlines the fact that they can be played with and can still communicate. So that, I mean, we see that in some of the passages that I've quoted from Joyce there, where he's taking those cliches, if we like, constructions, idioms, whatever we want to call them, and he's malforming them in some way. And sometimes he's producing wholly new communications through that. This is certainly a favourite tactic of poets. So Dylan Thomas, for instance, has a phrase, a grief ago. And he's using the time ago construction, which again is a little kind of mini grammar within the language. You have the word ago and you have a unit of time prior to it, and that communicates time ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 days ago. You can also say 2 stoplights ago or something like that. Thomas gets it and he makes it a grief ago. For us to parse that and make sense of it, we have to think something like, oh, maybe a grief is a unit of time. Yeah? But I think by malforming these little nodes of prosody and meaning and rule within the language, Joyce is reminding us that, yeah, they're kind of nodes of statistical habit, but they're not rules of the language in the sense that you cannot speak if you don't obey the structure of expectations they set up. Yeah. Actually, I think that's where this kind of analysis becomes super exciting, when you start to look at poetic diction.
Fantastic. I really enjoyed that, Paul. I thought it was so useful and so clear. I was interested in your comment. I spend a lot of time reading secondary literature associated with Lacan, and I've been reading some Julia Kristeva recently. So I was very interested in when you said Lacan said that this Joyce I think you said destroying the English language. So I'd love you to comment on that. And the other thing is that Kristeva talks about this mimesis, I think it is, the sort of copying of things, and in that copying, changing. And what I'm interested in that changing meaning, and in a poetic way. And she says that this allows you to join the social revolution, and that's the political aspect of this which really interests me. Any comment?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So the Lacan quote was he wrote it in such a way such that the English language no longer exists, and Lacan is actually paraphrasing Philippe Soler at the time. And I think what he's getting at is some of the terrain I just tried to sketch in responding to Jane. So if really what we're talking about when we look at a language is a kind of a congeries of, if you like, cliched behaviours that are kind of rule-based, but actually you can violate them. I'd say that the writer there is that so long as that new phrasing conveys some sort of meaning, and especially some way of, so long as it conveys something we don't otherwise have words for, that seems to be the kind of the way we judge these things when people muck up a construction like Dylan Thomas does. So what it's showing is that there's no such thing as the rules of the English language that are somehow discoverable by a linguist, that can be set up in a table. And when we're speaking, we actually just follow those rules. We use the vocabulary we associate with English, and it's almost like a computer algorithm, and we pump out, grammatically correct structures at the end. He's saying, no, it's not like that. It's this space of habitualized utterance that is inherently historical, malleable, and open to change. So that, for instance, prior to Dylan Thomas, you couldn't say a grief ago. That phrase just didn't exist. After him, that's now English. And what's more, with those particular kind of expressions, the consensus seems to be that as long as it names something we don't otherwise have words for, we're very happy to accept things as good, well-phrased English. Yeah? Even if they've never been said before and they totally violate the way we usually say things. Like in the 1960s, people started to say the military disappeared the journalist. They started to use an intransitive verb transitively because it was done in such a way that it carried these meanings of subterfuge and, I guess, plausible deniability. It actually sounded like good English, even though that was not possible a year before, 6 weeks before. And so I think that's the kind of idea in saying the English language no longer exists. It's really saying any language no longer exists. We're dealing with a much more mutable kind of field. And I guess that's related to this question of revolution. Revolution in language, to use Kristeva's phrase, though at the level of mimesis, at that level of producing what appears a veridical copy of reality, Finnegans Wake tends to get pretty low marks because it's not all that readily comprehensible. And this is often the complaint with Finnegans Wake by people who haven't discovered its pleasures, that it offers no joy at the level of narrative. It's just not possible to feel that you see a recognisable world and are excited to find out what's going to happen, to the protagonist, where love has gone wrong in chapter 1 and you're wondering what's going to happen in chapter 2 or whatever. So I guess it's It's not by way of mimesis, at least in that sense of the word.
Thanks, Paul. Really enjoyed this paper. And just picking up on that comment before about the cliche and these kind of constructions, and it seems like in those examples that you quoted, there's different kind of scales or kind of units of prior language that Joyce is working on. And obviously the Joycean pun is, a single word can be just spelled a different way or to open up another sense of meaning. And then a construction like see eye to eye. And a longer, it might be like a phrase from the Bible or a lyric from a song. And it seems like, in a sense, the sentence is I think you're right, that the sentence is not the kind of governing structure, the construction is. But in that big, long sentence that you quoted, it seems behind it is a kind of parody of a kind of legalistic, twisted kind of logical argument that's hard to follow and deceptive and twisting and turning. So there's a kind of template of a kind of form of prose that Joyce is kind of riffing off, even if it's not kind of passable as kind of a grammatical sentence. It is still a kind of, form of language usage or something like that as a kind of, in a more loose sense, like a construction. So I'm just wondering if those kind of levels, just how this changes, this idea of what a construction is, what are the open slots, what are the kind of fixed units, how does that change at different kind of scales, like the scale of a long sentence or a paragraph?
Yeah, thanks. That's really fabulous. Well, look, to go back to the construction grammarians for a moment, they certainly don't obliterate the sentence. They just say, a sentence is just another type of construction, like a subject-verb-object sentence. And they go and say there's lots of different types of sentences as well, each of which are differentiated because they have a different grammar and a different set of meanings associated with them. But with your comment on what Joyce is doing with the sentence there, I think it's fabulous. And there is an element of mimesis there, where, Joyce is representing a particular person who speaks a particular way. This whole chapter is generally troped around a professor, which is why it's always the best one to discourse upon academically, because you can feel the self-parody just staring you in the face with every quotation. I think what Joyce is kind of suggesting about those recognisable utterers who appear again and again in the wake, where you think, this is a professor speaking, this is a detective, this is this person, is, yes, they're very pompous and they feel like they have command of what they say because they have command of sentences, for instance, but actually they're just barking. They're raving off their heads, just stringing together these kind of, again, these congeries of moments of meaning. But actually there's nothing really holding it together other than the performance itself, the fact that the voice goes on. And I think this gets at the kind of political challenge too of this approach, of what Joyce is giving as a picture of language, because the sentence is so often regarded as the kind of commanding dimension of language, where we use the sentence to make a proposition about the world, and we call it a proposition. This is the way the world is. That's what the sentence does in one particular view of sentencehood. And I think Joyce is just ridiculing that in lots of ways. I think there's more to your question, but that's where I'm at with it at the moment.
Thank you. Just building on that, but can you talk a bit more about musicality? Because for me, so much of it comes from the sounds of the words and the rhythm. So much meaning comes from that for me.
I think there's a few different ways we could talk about musicality in the wake, up to and including the literal, because he actually includes two scores in the text. One is a 2.5-page or so street ballad, and the other is just a little snatch of music in the kind of marginalia of one of the pages. But actually, interestingly, that the musical notation given with the street ballad is actually unperformable Like there's an article on this. Someone actually tried to play it and realised that Joyce has been utterly devious, and he's scored this thing in such a way that you start going crazy as the musician because it's just impossible to fit within the time signatures and so forth. We've got that level of musicality, and then there's the music that comes across in the sentences. The burden of the paper here was to suggest that syntactic clarity, constructional clarity, whatever we're going to call it, actually is totally enmeshed with musicality and with performability, including just with our ability to look at the page and be able to instantly feel like we know how to pronounce these kooky words, because somehow the text is kind of pushing us that way. There's a vocal score dimension, and I'm trying to say that's actually inseparable from these questions of meaning and syntax. But we've also got alliteration, and it's full of alliteration, and you've also got a kind of incipient metrication in that so many passages from the Wake are actually punctuated in such a way that at the punctuation marker, you get another kind of 3-beat, almost poetic line. Like you can almost read the commas in certain places, or else rhymes that he uses as setting up something like a ballad verse. Crazy enough, a 3 or 4 beat kind of measure, which is the most recognisable, the one that most drags our bodies in and gets us kind of swaying with the language. That is definitely there as well, like this kind of sneaky, incipient metrication within prose. I mean, I think that's actually quite common in prose in general, though we don't tend to analyse it very much. But alliteration's another huge one. I would point to one other thing, which is that you get musicality and then you get dead air constantly with these type of sentences. Like there'll be something that just seems to sing beautifully, and then there'll be 7 words that just fall totally flat where you don't know how to say them. You just can't work out how to say them meaningfully. And the music turns to what we had Chomsky referring to before, was that deadened kind of thing where each word is pronounced as a separate phrase. Furiously sleep, ideas, green, colourless. That happens constantly too. So, it seems to be something that Joyce is either playing with or wanting to, where he wants to put his fingers kind of up our nose and make us feel that, you thought it was a musical book. Well, actually, here's another way I'm destroying the language for you. Like I'm not even allowing you to just enjoy it on the level of song. Happens super often. Yeah.
That was fabulous. And of course, bringing the text to life is even more fabulous. So thank you. I wanted to take a slightly different point of view, which is the modern problem that the AI people have when they do the generative work. Mm. And so when we have our generative AI, if they put in straight language structures, it doesn't work. They have to put in an error rate, and they call it a heat map. And so they have a certain percentage of error rate in terms of how generative to them means, how do I connect with my audience? And if I don't put in enough error rate with my generative AI, it doesn't work because my audience doesn't engage. And it's the same thing. So it's an evolutionary process by which AI or a structure of language can be engaged with its audience. And so it brings to mind the question of whether language itself has to have inbuilt evolutionary functions in the same way our genetics has an error rate, otherwise we don't evolve. If we don't have a certain percentage of errors in our genome every time we undergo meiosis, we don't evolve, we die. And so I just wonder whether partly what Joyce is doing in this instance, and I don't know that he was thinking of it in those terms, but what he's pointing out, I think, is if you put error rate in there and you test that, you test where language can go and you can test where you can take language.
Thank you. That's really illuminating. Look, I mean, the second slide I put up, I was suggesting this book came from Ireland. ERRORLAND, Joyce's pun on Ireland. And yes, I think what transpires from these situations where we read, we cannot see eye to eye, but we hear in our heads on some level we cannot see eye to eye. We hear the expected idiom. There is a kind of, if you like, a tolerance within our comprehension for language where, there can be so much deviation from a kind of ideal model of what the word should be, and we still basically grasp it as an instance, or we can say in our heads, oh, they probably mean this, And let me give you an illustration of this that happened last night that I just so loved. I had to write it down because so I was chatting with my girlfriend Alona, and she was talking about a patient of hers, and she said she was explaining that she was asked to make a decision about this patient, and she was saying to me, I'd never met them from a bar of soap. I'd never met them from a bar of soap. And I just said, oh, wow, she must be trying to say, I don't know them from a bar of soap or something like that. And I said, oh, I've got to write that down. This is perfect for my paper tomorrow. I'd never met them from a bar of soap. And as hearers, we have that kind of tolerance where we can make the repair. And I think Joyce is constantly pushing us to awareness of our desire to repair language. The fact that we do have that kind of error rate in comprehension. I mean, when I pressed Alona, she said, oh, but that's not what I said. I took it down. What she said was, I'd never met them. I know them from a bar of soap, but my hearing's not very good. So I heard I'd never met them from a bar of soap. So this is more of this we cannot see eye to eye. Yeah. But we do a good job of deluding ourselves that we do. And I think that would have to do with these things. And they must be necessary for communication to take I don't even know what I was about to say then, to take take flight.
Oh, Paul, now, look, that was enlightening. I mean, I've been reading the Wake all morning, and I was working on it yesterday afternoon, to have our meeting. And you said, I mean, that was very enlightening. Maybe I'm starting to pick up on that. Just to be able to see what's going on in the Wake and also to appreciate why we like it so much, But my second question was taken over by Michael, who not only asked the question, but seemed to answer it brilliantly, because I was just wondering, since you were talking about, I mean, basically, the whole, your whole paper is sort of going along the lines of linguistic rules, whether, what AI would do with the Wake and with this type of technique that's going on in it. But I think, that whole discussion about, or the whole suggestion about error and so on that Michael pointed out seems to answer the question, I think. So just that. But thank you. That was great. I mean, having had my head in the Wake all morning, you've now sort of explained what, just why at some stage you just break out in a smile, because I mean that's where the laughter sort of happens, because you can, those mechanisms sort of really doing something so interesting and so clever with language. It's a sort of poetry all through, really, isn't it?
Cheers, Gino. That's a pleasure. And look, I think we're opening up something really productive here. We're thinking about these error rates in terms of poetry more generally. There's got to be something, to follow up there too.
Thanks, Paul. That was fantastic. I'm really interested in circularity in the text in terms of obviously the famous beginning, famous ending, which just starts back at the beginning or starting in the middle, that continues back to the beginning. And so you can start the Wake anywhere and pick it up and still end up in the same spot. I love all those strange contradictions and loops in the Wake. But I'm interested in your work in repetition. And did that bring you to some interesting ideas within the Wake as well? Because I know that you're interested in that and how that works in language Not only mentioning I and I, but just, and I'm interested in I and I because growing up in Britain, there was a lot of Jamaican patois, and I and I was quite an interesting idea of Jamaicans and how they use I and I as well to represent love or one love or a people or a culture and all that kind of stuff as well. But
Sorry, Ifan, what was the word there? How they use
they say I and I. So when they're describing themselves, they're also describing their community or their people. They say I and I'm interested in, whatever it may be.
I and I.
I and I, yeah. I know. Or when they use the word I and I, yeah.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah. It's Jamaican patois, yeah, for sure.
I and I.
Yeah.
Gosh, yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it makes sense because certainly the way we, in the kind of, let's say, standard British English, you can't even really say that anymore now Jamaican is standard British English.
Yeah.
But let's say in the grammar book version of English, the way our pronouns are splayed out are not the same as in other languages.
Sure.
Like there's languages where you have a couple of words for we, and one of them means, one version of we means you and me, us together. Another version means me and my people here, but not you guys.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and that's a separate pronoun. Like, there's no reason why the pronouns always have to be the way that we imagine they've always been, and they haven't. Yeah. With regard to repetition, well, I guess the thing with Finnegans Wake, where it's so exhausting, is that there's something new every 2 or 3 words, and it can be utterly draining. Like Gino and Russell and I read together in a group. We read The Wake, and that brings a real joy to the encounter, but it also takes a lot of the burden away from the individual reader, just dealing with this constant influx of novelty, or of situations where you're called upon to repair your understanding of the language in some way. And so that in some ways, I think of The Wake as the least repetitious book ever. But then it has that wonderful circular structure where the first sentence begins on the last page of the book and winds over the front. And look, maybe just one more thing I'll say, which goes back to this question of prosody, is that when you look at the very last few words of The Wake, which is the start of the first sentence of the book, it's away, alone, along, aloved. I think that's the run, yeah? Away, alone, along, aloved, the river run, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us via a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Hoath Castle and environs. When you get to that away, alone, aloved, it's actually the prosodic figure or lack of figure that Chomsky's talking about, where it's not a standard sentence intonation. You pronounce each one as a separate phrase because you can't see any syntax joining them. In this particular place, it has this kind of rhythmic propulsion. It's really funny. It's almost like he's playing with that total deadening of rhythm and when you face a meaningless utterance, but he's kind of getting a weird music out of it as well. It's this funny meeting point of the two.
Sorry to butt in. One thing is that the labour of reading it, we normally try to cope with that by having a beer and doing it in the pub, which is quite... but there is, about that I and I thing, on page 410, which is very close to what we would have been reading yesterday, he actually does have, or to isolate I and an I, to isolate I from my multiple me's or mes, M-E-S. So, he's playing with that all the time, the I, of course, but, for the reference to the Jamaican using I and I supposed to say we, a community. You go back to The Wake and you find he's already doing something like that somewhere in The Wake. So it's on page 410. about halfway down the page.
Fantastic.
Or to isolate I from my multiple me's, and then it goes on, and then it changes.
Thanks, Gino. I think we'll leave it there. We'll put the full stop on that multiple I.